everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold here with our weekly lecture series. Today's lecture is on the Scotch Gambit. The lecture is sponsored by the family of Don Dons as a belated birthday gift. Happy birthday, Don. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture, you can contact the email on the screen right now. Karen, my wife, she takes care of all the sponsored lectures, make sure everybody shows up and pays and sponsors and all kinds of stuff. Then you can decide probably what the lecture will be on. The Scotch Gambit is pretty rare, and we're going to look at 5 games today. We probably should look at about 10 so we can see all the different lines, but the lecture's not that long, so I can't look at 10 games. Although I have looked at 10 games before in a lecture, but it's very rare. So I went to Wikipedia, and they don't have a Scotch Gambit Wikipedia, but they have a Scotch Game Wikipedia, which you can see if I move up here. Then Scotch Game or Scotch Opening, then they have a picture of it here. Then if you go down, they talk about the Scotch Gambit, and I highlighted in blue here. That's their Scotch Gambit, and they have a picture of a diagram of the starting position. And they talk about different lines that can be played. And when I have a real chessboard where I'm making moves, I'm going to show you some stuff before I go over the games that I have. You can read about that here. Famous game between Meek and Morphy in this line, which actually we're going to look at. Not that game, we're going to look at a better game, and so forth. Okay, then there's another article I thought was interesting on the Scotch Gambit. It's from a place I've never heard of called chesspathways.com. So if you want to get a video or some more instruction on the Scotch Gambit after this video, chesspathways.com has a whole thing on the Scotch Gambit, and they talk about it here. Different lines people can play, different kinds of middle game positions, and all kinds of stuff. So I thought that was a good website for the Scotch Gambit. Fourth move alternatives, conclusions, etc. So it's chesspathways.com, and I guess they have other openings and videos too, but this seems pretty good on the Scotch Gambit, so reasonable. Okay, so first, I want to discuss how the Scotch Gambit happens and why it happens. So first of all, the Scotch is e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4. And between, I'm going to say 1900 and 1990, although my first number could be off, people didn't play the Scotch with white. And then when I say people didn't play the Scotch, I mean super GM games, probably 1% were the Scotch. So it was played at the lower levels. Mepex knows what I'm talking about. Okay, but then in 1990, something happened. In 1990, I was in Novi Sad, Yugoslavia, which was a country at the time, and I was the Belgian women's team captain at the Olympiad. And my wife at the time, I don't know which wife, because it was 1990, I can't remember everybody I was married to. And my wife at the time was board 1 for Belgium, even though she was American. We lived in Belgium, and she played for Belgium when we lived in Belgium. And then when we moved back to the U.S., she played for the U.S. again. But anyway, during that Olympiad, there was a World Chess Championship match going on between Karpov and Kasparov. And surprisingly, Kasparov played the Scotch, which is not played in World Championships. And the game ended in a draw where Kasparov, I think, had the advantage most of the time. Then the next game, Kasparov was white. He played it again, and he won. And then after those 2 games in the 1990 World Championship, then Kasparov and other people started playing the Scotch. So typically, when a world champion or a world-class player starts playing an old and forgotten opening, then everybody gets on the bandwagon and starts playing it again, especially since he got 1.5 out of 2. Okay, and unfortunately, that kind of fervor hasn't reached the Scotch Gambit yet, and all it takes is one guy, somebody like, Richard Report, because he'll do anything, to start playing the Gambit, and then people will start looking at it again. Scotch Gambit is, after takes, instead of taking back, which is the regular Scotch, knight takes d4, that's the Scotch, is white plays a Gambit. And if white plays c3, that's not called the Scotch Gambit, but it is a Gambit in the Scotch, so, it's a Gambit. Scotch Gambit typically starts with bishop c4. Okay, now, in this position, black has 5 or 6 moves they can play, and we're going to concentrate on 2 of them because I would say, and Mepex may disagree, I would say 90% of games in this position feature 2 different moves for black. There's 3 moves that black could play. I mean, black could play anything. What do I know? Black could play queen e7 for all I know. There's 3 moves that black could play that we're not going to look at the games. Bishop b4 check, which is reasonable. d6, and bishop e7. Bishop e7, I wouldn't even call a Scotch Gambit. I would call this the Hungarian. And one of my quickest games ever, but not my quickest, but one of my quickest, was when I was 14 years old. I was like, maybe I was 13. I was like 2100. I was playing a 1400 in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And I got this position by transposition. And I played c3, and he took, and I played queen d5, and he resigned. And that's the point of the Scotch Gambit for white, is white's playing very aggressively and trying to attack black. And if white loses a pawn or 2, these things happen. Sometimes you lose a pawn or 2. And this position's not resignable, but a lot of people resign because you're threatening mate, and the only way to stop it is knight h6. Then you take the knight, and people are like, well, he's still threatening mate, and I'm still down a knight. And after castles, although black's position is not good here, it's not resignable because black is threatening to take the bishop, black's threatening to take the pawn on b2, which wins the rook in the corner. And if bishop to c1, knight b4 attacks the queen, it threatens knight c2 check, forking the king and rook. And if queen d1, then c2 forks the knight and the queen. And this is all well known, but it wasn't well known to my opponent. So after queen d5, he resigned. He was expecting, after he took my pawn on c3, that I would probably take back. So when I surprised him with queen d5, he resigned, which is not the best move. Maybe he was preparing to play Carissa Yip this year in the U.S. Women's. So he was prepared because he had to resign because that's what he was going to do later. Okay, so black could play bishop e7, bishop b4 check, or d6. But we're going to look at the 2 most common moves, bishop c5 and knight f6. And in one of those lines, it seems like there's a new main line from 150 years ago. Who would have thunk that every 150 years a new line happens? Okay, probably not me. Okay, now, very few games in slow chess feature super grandmasters in this position, the Scotch Gambit. However, I did find one, and I was doing commentary for the tournament, so I remember the game actually. This is a game, Hikaru Nakamura's white, and again, if somebody 2,700 FIDE or higher is going to play the Scotch Gambit, it's probably Hikaru. And he's white against Alexander Onischuk. And there's 2 Onischuks, so don't get them confused. Alexander Onischuk was born in the Ukraine, but has played for the U.S. for the last 30 years. The other Onischuk does play for the Ukraine. Probably the other Onischuk is better now, but I think career-wise, the American one is better at chess. Okay, and Onischuk played knight f6. which is one of the most common moves. Now, if you're a stickler, which some of you are, and you probably shouldn't be, you could argue, okay, this isn't a Scotch Gambit anymore. This is the two knights, because this position could occur after the two knights. So, for example, if white plays bishop c4 and black plays the two knights, white usually plays knight g5 or d3, one of those two moves, but white can also play d4. Black usually takes, and that's the same position. So some of these openings transpose, and the other main line that black can play can also transpose from different variations, different move orders. Okay, so we're looking at d4, bishop c4, knight f6. So this is either the Scotch Gambit or the two knights, depending on what, who you're rooting for. Okay, and white plays e5. Another main line, which I'm not looking at, but I'm going to show you because it's a lecture on this opening, is castles. Black has more than one move here, but the most interesting is knight takes e4, rook e1, d5, bishop d5, queen d5, and then knight c3. And if you've never seen this before, then this is fascinating because black is pinned everywhere. You can't take with the knight because it's illegal. Your king would be in check. You can't take with the pawn because it should be illegal. And so here black can play queen h5, queen a5, queen f5. People argue what the best move is. And then there's a lot of theory, and theory says black is at least okay. But a lot of people will play this with white, including St. Louis Chess Club executive director Tony Rich, who's a 2000 player at chess, and he has had white in this position dozens of times. And he says, it doesn't give an advantage, but I like it. Okay? And you may differ. You might think white's better. You might think black's better. Super GMs don't play it with white very often, so probably black's okay. So that's one line, is white can castle. More common is to play e5, d5, and that's the main move. And now the main line for white is bishop to b5. Knight e4 is the most common move. Black can also play knight d7. Knight takes d4. And this is a very common line amongst players rated 1200 to 2300 in scholastic tournaments. So if you go to a scholastic tournament and you find a game that goes e4, e5, and the players are 1400, 1800, 2200, you're going to see this position a lot. This is a very common line for those players. At the Super GM level, not as common. Bishop c5, you can also play bishop d7, bishop e3, castles, and the players quickly played this main line, which they both knew. Materials equal, and this pawn is attacked, and this pawn is attacked on b2. And I can prove it because black took the b2 pawn and white took the d5 pawn. And they got this position, which I'm assuming both players were familiar with. And for a long time, it looked like it was going to be a draw because materials equal and nobody really has a big advantage here. But slowly but surely, Nakamura outplayed Onischuk. And this position looks even more drawn. Black can take on e5 whenever he wants. He decided to take now. Looks like we're just going to trade pawns, but Nakamura says, I'm going to win your pawn, and you're not going to win my pawn. That's what he's hoping. And that's what happened. Nakamura got luffed. And it looks like it's going to be hard for white to promote that pawn. But later in the game, it got tactical, which is good for Nakamura. Rook d7. For example, white could play knight d4 here, forking the rooks. which I suppose doesn't work. Yeah, because I can play rook takes b4, rook takes b4, rook e1 check, and then knight takes, and that's a dead draw. Okay, so he played rook d7, attacking the knight, knight f2, materials equal, knight d4, the rook has to stay on the knight, and the rooks are forked, so we check, then we check, and the king goes to g2. Obviously, if white plays king g1, they can repeat and draw. Check, and knight takes rook, and black resigned. Black's down a rook. And in this position, the rooks are forked, so I guess there's really nothing to do. Now, in this position, it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, I've been wrong before, black should try the move rook to d2. That seems to not lose immediately. On the other hand, I guess I can check and check on either f5 or e6 and then take the rook. So I guess it does lose immediately. So it looks like after knight takes f2 check, black is just losing. But the knight's hanging and knight d4 is forking the rooks. And if I remember correctly, and I do, Onischuk was in bad time trouble. So they played a very complicated opening. They got a position that was relatively equal, and eventually Hikaru outplayed his opponent in the time trouble, and black, unfortunately for him, ended up having all of his pieces attacked. The knight rook's attacked, the other rook's attacked, the knight is attacked. And in this position, I don't see anything that I could do to not lose. Because if you play rook d2 here, I can take, and then if you take my rook, I take your knight. So it looks like Onischuk just got tricked tactically in time trouble and ended up losing. So the opening didn't really win the game for Hikaru. On the other hand, Hikaru played an opening, the Scotch Gambit, that you don't see a lot at the very top level, and he beat a strong grandmaster in the U.S. Championship. So maybe we should see it more. Okay, next game, David Navara has black. He's been one of the top 3 players in the Czech Republic for, 15 years. And I could have said he's been the best player in the Czech Republic for the last 15 years. That's probably not going to be refuted. Anyway, David Navara is known as the nicest guy in chess. Unfortunately, I've never met him, but everybody says he's a really nice guy. He's playing a 2200. However, he's playing a simultaneous exhibition, so that makes it tougher. Okay, since it's a Scotch Gambit and White's playing the Scotch Gambit, I didn't necessarily want to show all games that White won, because you might think the Scotch Gambit wins by force. Maybe Meepex thinks that. So White did not win this game, but I'll still show it from White's point of view. Okay, and this is the starting position of our lecture, the Scotch Gambit. Knight f6, which we saw in the previous game. e5, d5, and this is just like the last game. Everything's the same. The dogs agree. Okay, this is still the same as the last game. Okay, this is still the Hikaru game with Onischuk. Hikaru castled here, and White played queen takes d5 in this game, also a move. And Navara did not trade queens, which happened very early in the Nakamura game, but played queen e7. Obviously, Navara, being almost 500 points higher rated than his opponent and giving a Simul, doesn't want to draw. He's not Boris Spassky. If Boris Spassky was black, then he would want to draw. Okay, because that's how he gives Simuls. Okay, the dogs are agreeing or disagreeing, I'm not sure. Okay, castles, bishop a6 attacking the rook. Rook d8 attacking the queen. And knight e6 with the idea of playing knight to d4. Navara is not in a hurry to take his pawn back. He keeps making active threats and making it difficult for white. Knight c3, developing a piece. Finally takes his pawn back. Now material's equal. Although I said material's equal, but I can see that white's up a pawn. So I was close. Man, that's a funny gambit. You gambit a pawn, then you play 12, 13 moves of theory, and then you're up a pawn. Very suspicious. But black has threats against c2 pawn, active rooks, knight and bishop, very active position. And white's pawn on e5 is actually helping black more than white. It's positionally not well placed. It's blocking my rook. It blocks the diagonals. So it's not, white would rather have their pawn on e4, e3. Okay, knight d5, queen c5, rook d1, defending the knight, takes, now material's equal. And white went crazy with knight f6 check, which is good for us, because I'm giving a chess lecture, and I want to see craziness. Now, in this position, black is not threatening queen takes bishop, because knight e7 check would pick up the queen. So white could have made any move they wanted, but it's not easy to find a good move here for white that makes any sense. Like if you play knight e3, then the a pawn's hanging, and the bishop on c6 is hanging because you don't have knight e7 check anymore. So it's not easy to find a good move here, and it's not clear that knight f6 is a bad move. I know the result of the game, but that's cheating. Okay, g takes f6, takes. Now white's down a piece, and white is threatening queen to the g file check, and then queen g7 mate with advantage. And if you don't like that, like you're typing like, I don't like that. Okay, you're on YouTube, you're watching live here on Zoom. I don't like queen g. Okay, fine. Then white's threatening rook e8 check. Is that better? Okay, so white has a lot of threats. Black played knight e6, stopping rook e8 check, and the knight defends g7. Bishop went to a4, attacking the rook on c2. Rook c1. Bishop d1, stopping the rook trade. Black threatens everything. The queen, the rook. Check. And now white wants to play queen g7 check, but that would be hanging the queen. So white sacrificed the exchange. If black does something silly like take, then we check and play checkmate. So instead of taking the rook, Navara plays rook takes d1 check, then takes the rook. White still gets a big attack. Check, queen check, queen check. And the problem is black is threatening checkmate everywhere. And if white takes time out and stops checkmate, then I can take this pawn on f6 and black is up a piece. So white stopped checkmate and stopped queen takes f6 and played g4 check. Now the king has a square. Black has to move the king. White would like to play f7, f8, but f7 hangs the queen. So he checked on h6 first. You can't play king f3 because we have a skewer. So king e5, f7, and white has unstoppable f8 equals queen. So maybe white thought he was doing well here. And if it was white's turn to move, I think white is doing well. But it's black's turn to move. So black plays queen e1, only legal move. Bishop b7, never play f3, queen check. Then he checks on the back rank because then the king has to move up and you get to take the f3 pawn with check. And then he takes the pawn on f7 and black is up a piece and a pawn. White gave a few spite checks. And when he had no more checks left and no more checks in the future, then he resigned. So that was a very exciting game. White got a big attack, sacrificed material, was checking his opponent's king all the way up the board. And in the end, somehow the higher rated player won. Amazing. And that wasn't amazing for a Simul game. You're given a simul and your king's walking up the board and the guy's queening his pawn. So I'm sure for the spectators, that was pretty impressive, that kind of a game. And in the 1800s, when the Scotch Gambit was popular, people liked, even when they lost, they liked somebody sacked a piece or two, somebody's king's running up the board, somebody's getting mated, somebody didn't get mated and they're up 2 pieces. People liked that. Spectators liked it, the players liked it. And nowadays, the players don't like that. The players want to be easily winning, have positional advantages, have winning endgames, have a safe king. So these openings become less popular because you don't feel like you're in control of the game. You feel like somebody's going to win, but that might not be you. And higher rated players, when they're paired down, now that everybody has a rating, they're like, well, I can't lose to that guy. He's 500 points less than me. So I can't play wild and crazy and get some position I have no control over. And that's unfortunate because that's the kind of chess that we want to see. So the better you calculate, like Navara or Hikaru, you can win these games and not have boring draws when you play double king pawn openings. Okay, now there's other variations. This is the game Guseinov versus Sjugirov. Sjugirov plays for a lot of different countries. This was played last year in the Division 3 of the Airthings Rapid. So obviously it's a Scotch Gambit because that's what this lecture is about. Bishop c5 we haven't looked at yet as a game. That's one of the popular moves also. Now in this position, we could do a transposition, so I'm not going to look at it, but I'm going to show you. White can play c3, and theory says if you take it, that this is good for white. And then white takes, usually with check, and then can take on c3. And engine prefers white here. But after c3, instead of taking it, we can play knight f6, and this transposes into a main line of the Joko piano from 150 years ago. The most famous game is the game played in Hastings, 1895, between Steinitz and von Bardeleben, which I've lectured on many times. And the way you would normally get that position is bishop c4, bishop c5, c3, knight f6, d4, takes. And if white plays c3 in the Scotch Gambit and black plays knight f6, it's the same position. Okay, so white didn't play c3, white played knight g5. And knight g5 has actually gained some popularity in the last 10 years at the grandmaster level, typically in rapid and blitz, and this game is a rapid game. So these players are both very strong. Guseinov 26-61, Sjugirov is 27-12. He played, I think, board 2 for either Romania or Hungary, a country he didn't originally play for. Okay, so the move we're going to look at later is castles, which is a move that I've played in blitz chess a lot. Knight g5 is obviously forcing the issue. The best move is considered to be knight h6, and now we take everything. Take on f7, take on f7 again, and queen h5 check picks up the bishop on c5. g6, queen takes c5. So this has equal material, and it's probably about equal, but if you play with white and you want to have this position, you're going to have this position. If you're black, you're never going to have this position unless you play somebody with white who plays this, which is pretty rare. So I think one of the advantages is if you have white and you have this 10 times a year and your opponent has it once a year, you have a practical advantage. Okay, Sjugirov played queen e7, trade queens. Queens were traded, and it's just sort of a somewhat boring endgame, sort of an equalish endgame. and the better player should win, which in this case, the lower rated player won. And it still looks relatively equal. Maybe white's a little better with the nice pin here, against the knight. Well, that's the end of that pin. White wins a pawn. Black gets big counterplay. Then they go into a rook ending where everybody has passed pawns. Everybody has passed pawns tonight. And the problem with black winning this pawn... Oh, I pushed the wrong button. By playing like rook f2 and takes or rook h3 and takes is this pawn's too quick. So black did play rook f2, then black changed his mind and played g4. So that loss of a tempo wasn't good, but I think he was losing anyway. And then everybody made a queen because chess is fun. Okay, and so white wants to play rook check and then queen would check, and black wants to play rook check and then queen would check. So in this position after rook check, black didn't take the rook because white would promote with check, and black played here. And now white played rook c8 check because this stops black from checking white in case black doesn't take the rook. We queen, and if you sack your rook and play for perpetual, because the rook is on c8, there are no more checks. Checks are gone. There's no check here, there's no check here. So white's up a rook. So black decided to just take the rook on c8, and then after queen, it's check, and then queen g2 wins the pawn on f2. You can't play check and queen because I've defended the queening square. So that doesn't work. So after queen g2, then black resigned. So they got a very interesting position, very unusual. They got to a somewhat equal ending, and it was a rapid game. Eventually, white outplayed black, and white won. And you would think, I would think, the way openings are today, nobody's getting a big advantage with white anymore. People have worked out how to play black in all the common systems against e4 and d4. People are drawing with the Petrov at the top level. People are drawing with the Berlin at the top level. Against d4, people are playing the Slav, the semi-Slav, the Nimzo-Indian with black, Catalan, and Queen's Gambit declined. And it seems like white isn't really getting very much. So why not try something new like this? You get equal position, maybe a better position if your opponent doesn't know a lot of theory, which is likely, and then you get to outplay them. So very reasonable. Okay, next game is similar. It's Stukopin versus Josiah Stearman. This was played in Seattle in some strong round robin. These guys have played a lot before. These guys play in round robins all over the US, getting GM norms and getting their FIDE ratings higher. White is a grandmaster, higher rated player. Josiah, a few years ago, was going to Stanford. So I don't know if he's still going to Stanford or he graduated. Or maybe I made up Stanford. I don't think I did. Well, if I did, that's funny. Okay, so I played Josiah Stearman once and I lost. So as revenge for losing to him, here's a game that he lost. And when I was playing the game over earlier, I didn't think, white had all that much. And then it got really tricky. Okay, so they got the transposition. Okay, if you want the actual Scotch Gambit move order, it's this. That's the line we just looked at earlier. But they played a different move order. Okay, and then castles. Earlier, we looked at a couple of games with e5, and then knight here, and so forth. This was a couple of games we looked at. Navara won with black, Hikaru won with white. Okay, and Stukopin played castles. bishop c5. So now we're transposing to the bishop c5 line move order, which can happen from either move order. This one, or if we do this kind of Scotch Gambit, new variation, castles is a move, knight f6, and then e5, and then this is the game we're looking at now. So 2 different move orders, 3 different move orders. These positions can occur. Okay. Now, when I was learning chess in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, everybody played rook e1 check, and then knight g5. Then about 30% of people would blunder with queen takes f6, and you take, queen h5 check, and you pick up the bishop on c5. I've had this on my stream a few times. Sometimes my opponents resign here. Sometimes they resign after I take their bishop. And sometimes they play on a piece down, and I usually win. And then in this position, we're going to see in a later game, queen d5 is the main move. But it turns out that the modern way of playing this for white is to not play rook e1 check. And I mean, 150 years ago, 100 years ago, that was unheard of. But now they just take on g7 and play bishop g5. And now supposedly, black needs to play bishop e7 here. And we don't see that when white plays the rook e1 check, bishop e6 lines. We usually see black play something like queen to d5, which theory now says is not good. So black, new theory. He's a young player, bishop e7. He's probably about 20 now. And they traded. King takes is the best move. Otherwise, d4 is hanging. The d4 pawn is quite a nice pawn duo. And you want to defend your pawn. And again, the players know this. Now rook e1 check. The king is on e7. But that didn't seem to hurt black. It seemed like black's position was very reasonable. And they go into an endgame. And I would think if 2 engines were playing, this game would probably end in a draw because white's going to win their pawn back on c4. Material's equal. And I think black did well in the opening. I think black escaped any complications and has a position where the better player should usually win. Unfortunately for black, white was the higher rated player, so maybe he's the better player. But it got incredibly tactical considering it doesn't seem very tactical. Like here I would be like, wow, the pawn's attacked, this pawn's attacked, and I would probably take black. Then white played a4, attacking everything on the queen side. Take on b5, take on a7, take on c6. And if we double rooks on the 7th, we're not threatening rook g2 because our knight's covering that. So a6, stop rook takes f2. And again, I think black is doing fine here. And all of a sudden, white got this terrific counterplay. b4, attacking c5. Now white's threatening knight c4 check, forking the king and rook. So rook defends the pawn and stops it. f5, you can't take on f5 because knight takes f5, forks the king and rook. So it got really tactical all of a sudden. Attack each other's knights. And now white has a very strong advanced past f pawn. And if it was white's move, f7 would win. So black played rook here to play rook f2. White's up 2 pawns. That defends the pawn because if you take it, knight e8 check wins the rook on f6. So knight c7 was a cool move. Knight g4, king g1, excellent move. Again, you can't take with the rook because knight e8 check. And if you take with the knight, I want to say knight e8 check wins, but I could play king to e5 there. Oh, then I could play rook f7? Oh yeah, rook f7. Yeah. I'm learning how to play chess too. Knight e8 check. If you take it, you lose your rook. And if you take the rook now, black can take the rook on h7, although this might be winning for white, maybe. But this just seems to win because now I can play rook f7. Yeah, now I give up if I'm black. Now I don't see what to do. Okay. So instead of doing all that, he played rook f5, knight e8 check, and then f7. And in this position, white's threatening rook h5. And if you play rook takes rook, I queen. And if you don't play rook takes rook, I queen. Or I take the rook and then queen. So he played rook f3. And then after rook h5 check, he resigned because there's going to be a skewer. Or wait, it's a pin. It's not a skewer. If the king goes to one of the legal squares, then I pin the knight. The only way to defend the knight is to stop your rook from defending against queening. So now you lose your knight. And George Benson says, oh, give me the knight. Or is it Jeffrey Osborne? Also, if rook takes f7, white has a choice of wins, taking the knight or knight d6 check, winning the rook. So after rook h5 check, black resigned. So that was a very complicated endgame, and I think the opening worked out fine for black, just got outplayed later in the game. And I wanted to show that line, the old main line. This is a game where Glenn Flear, the British Grandmaster, was black against Gabriel, Maro, Vincente, Haro. Man, what a great name. Okay, and again, I didn't want to show every game that white won because that seemed unfair. They played the same line I was showing you that was played long ago, except in this position, white did play rook e1 check, which is the old main line. This game was played in 95. I don't think they were playing FG in 95. And then this line, which I showed you earlier. And this is considered to be fine for black. Again, if you take the queen, your bishop on e6 is pinned. So it's funny, like this position's a main line. Those other positions are main lines. And if you're super GM and you're playing double king pawn with black, you have to know those lines, even though they almost never happen. So if you're a class player, 1800, 1900, 2000, and you're playing a super GM, which is unlikely, and you play this a lot with white, they're going to be like, oh yeah, I studied this 3 years ago. And then maybe they won't remember what to do. Okay, so queen f5 is the main move. Knight e4 is a move, g4 is a move. And this is all theory. And black's position's pretty good, I think. But both sides, I thought, played very well. They traded some pieces off. And they got to a really interesting endgame where white was pushing all the kingside pawns and black was pushing all the queenside pawns. It's exciting if you're watching. If you're playing, it's nerve-wracking. This actually happens in this opening a lot. Black gets the big queenside attack, and white plays on the king side. So everybody's pushing their pawns, except that black has an extra pawn. And white gets the pawn back, proving me a liar. So even material, but black's d pawn looks pretty strong. d2's the threat. Can't trade rooks because the pawn queens. Everybody's getting a lot of passed pawns. And g7's a mistake, but he's losing anyway. But rook takes g5, stops the pawn. And white resigned. So that game was decided in the end game, but I think the opening showed that black's position was fine. The better player won. In most of the games, the better player won, even though nobody was getting a big advantage out of the opening because I was showing you how to play correctly. I was like, this is what white should do. this is what black should do. Then the games would end in the end game when people would start making mistakes in time trouble or just getting outplayed by their higher rated opponent. Anyway, if you have the white pieces and you want to play the Scotch Gambit and you're like, a lot of super GMs don't play it. Maybe it's unsound. I don't agree. I think the positions are about equal, just with any other opening. And if you understand the positions and have more experience than your opponent with either color, you'll have good results. Once again, I want to thank the sponsor, the family of Don Dons. Happy birthday, happy belated birthday. And if you want to sponsor a lecture, contact Karen. I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe and leave a comment. It really helps the channel. And I'll see you guys next time with more weekly lectures. Bye, everybody.